this is generally when I go over a few brief announcements before I turn things over to our monthly speaker. First of all, I guess the most pertinent thing to know is that we're going to have a holiday party coming up here shortly. We usually have one every year. I'm sad to say that our normal sponsor didn't come through, and I've been too busy to find replacements this year, so there will not be the normal free drinks, but there will be good camaraderie, so you should all come out and hang out anyway. It's going to be Thursday the 19th, I believe that's the right date. It's whatever the Thursday of that week is. Thursday the 19th at 7 p.m. at Lazarus Brewing on East 6th Street. So just come hang out and have a beer and join us.
So who's the organization that's putting that on?
We are, EFF-Austin.
EFF.
Yes, yes. Well, EFF-Austin, but EFF, we coordinate a lot with them. They'll probably promote our event in some fashion. I usually chat with them pretty regularly out in San Fran. But yeah, so that'll be in a couple weeks here. You should come out. It'll be fun. For those of you who've not been to our meetups before, they usually are on the second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. here. It will continue on that date and time next year. We are currently in the process of figuring out next year's speakers. Normally, I might have a few upcoming talks to announce, but we're still going through that. We'll also be having a South by Southwest gathering party like we usually do every year. That will probably be the first Saturday of South by Southwest Interactive at our board member Chris Boyd's house. We are currently interested in potential interesting VIP speakers who might be fun for our guests. So if you have a connection to somebody cool who this community might want to hear from at our South by Southwest gathering, get at me. Let's see. Anything else I need to go over at this point in time? We're getting toward the end of the year, so I don't think we have too many other announcements going on right now. Also, I like to turn things over usually briefly to the room and the community and ask if anybody has anything going on that they would like to share with the community. Shameless self-promotion's totally allowed, so if there's anything going on that you think the digital celebrities community would be interested in, feel free to let everybody know. Anybody got anything? Cool. And I guess one thing I'll say is I'll continue to let people know that our friends at EFF-Austin continue to have their monthly meetups on the first Wednesday of every month at 6:30 p.m. at Mozart's Coffee. So if you care about doing fun sort of hackery things to try to build a new web that is not centralized and lets you socialize without a corporate conglomerate in between and actually want to work on with people who are actually trying to build the tools to make that happen, they're cool people and you should go hang out with them.
I like that.
Oh, it's very cool. You should Google it. But, eventually, or DuckDuckGo it, I should say. So let's see. I think that's everything I've got at the moment. So normally I would introduce our speaker, but actually I was connected with our speaker at our board member Ritika's recommendation, and she knows him better than I do. So she's actually going to be doing his introduction this week. So why don't you take it away, Ritika?
All right. I'll keep this really brief. Today's speaker this month is a good friend of mine, Ian Sire, and he is a sculptor and a software engineer. So I'm interested to see how the blend of those two kind of comes out. He's created this very interesting project, and essentially, I'll let him explain it further, but I think it's very cool because, like Ian, I am fascinated by the way that knowledge and the distribution of information kind of drives, there's a lot of power in that. So I actually worked at Wikipedia one summer, and so I had no idea that we had this in common, but I'm very big into the democratization of information, and I think his project really speaks to that. So I'll let him explain it more eloquently than I can, but take it away.
Cool. Well, first, I want to say thanks to Kevin and Ritika and EFF-Austin in general for letting me give this talk about a project that me, Steven, and Adam in the back there, and another person have been working on for just over a year now. So I'll start off with something rather unprovocative, which is that knowledge is power. and I feel like no PowerPoint slide with that title can't have a picture of Michel Foucault on it. He was a French philosopher slash historian who focused a lot on how knowledge generates power, and particularly how knowledge gets produced and distributed, and the various mechanisms that allow for that production and distribution to congeal into power that kind of shapes the world. So it's our belief that what we know actually determines what we're able to know. So it's very important that we focus on the tools that kind of, produce and distribute power, because that kind of shapes our ability to actually progress within the world and reach new understandings. There are very real and very material tools used to do this. We've got oral histories, books, the news, family culture, schools, laws, grammar. It's all sorts of micro and macro level things that kind of shape the world around us. So we think that we need to focus on Wikipedia pretty heavily here. If you haven't heard of Wikipedia, I recommend that you go to Wikipedia and Wikipedia it. It is a multilingual online encyclopedia. It's created and maintained as an open collaboration project by a community of volunteer editors using a wiki-based editing system. It is the largest and most popular general reference work on the World Wide Web. So it's this open source, free content license encyclopedia that strives towards openness and transparency. And it's achieved a pretty amazing thing. We think it's the most comprehensive trove of information available to humans right now, in both depth and breadth. In terms of depth, it regularly outperforms printed encyclopedias and other reference materials because of its design. It's highly editable and can adapt to information in real time as it happens. And in terms of breadth, I looked this up, there are 27 billion words in 40 million articles in 293 languages. English Wikipedia alone has 3.7 words, which makes it 85 times larger than the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, which is pretty awesome. And the 293 languages is actually really important because if you're producing a bunch of information, but only a select few can access it, that's not really useful information. It's rather, non-democratic. So having it be in so many languages is super important because information needs to be globally accessible, and Wikipedia has done a great job of doing that. And another side note on accessibility, there's actually a whole little shadow Wikipedia called Simple Wikipedia, which a lot of people don't know about. But essentially you can find simplified layman terms articles for complex topics that may relate to math or sciences that may be rather impenetrable unless you have a lot of education. So if you find something that you can't really understand on Wikipedia, there might be a simple Wikipedia article for it. So we want to kind of zoom out and take the depth and breadth that Wikipedia has achieved that we think is absolutely monumental, and think about it from an archaeological scale. When we lose a library like the Library of Alexandria, it's a tragic event, and we learn about it. And it's sad, all this information is gone. And we have modern libraries as well, and they all host a lot of information that's really relevant to what's going on at the time. But we think that in terms of sheer volume, they kind of pale in comparison to Wikipedia. And in fact, I like to say that if the world were to end and you had buried in a very durable flash drive Wikipedia in English and Mandarin, it would probably be one of the most important archaeological artifacts that could be discovered. You'd be able to recreate a huge amount of science, arts, social studies, history, things that are normally lost in events like a fire relatively easily, as long as you could decode it. That might actually be a very useful post-apocalyptic tool as well. There's a lot of info there. So kind of want to pivot and bring up, we've got this huge trove of information, but how do we access it? This is kind of important to accessibility, and it's kind of useless if it's just sitting on a database somewhere. So there's this paradigm by some more French philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. There were some post-Lacanian French philosophers, studied a lot of different topics, but mainly focused on how capitalism produces power and produces culture as well. And one of their major focuses was that of what they called the rhizome. Botanically speaking, a rhizome is a continuously growing horizontal underground stem which puts out lateral shoots and roots at intervals. And this is kind of got a little window. But they continue that any point of a rhizome can be connected to any other, and in fact must be. This is very different from the tree or root, which plots a point and fixes an order. A rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and circumstances relative to the arts, sciences, and social struggles. And this was kind of a relatively novel conception of things at the time. A reorganization of histories, interpretations, and discourses to help begin kind of the early fledglings of postmodernism, where you could actually challenge traditional hierarchies. And they really drive the point home here. It's really simple. We're tired of trees. We used to stop believing in trees, roots, and radicals. So they're proposing this horizontal conception and organization of information, rather than a vertical narrative that you might hear through other sources. So we think that we can actually take the rhizome and really use it to critique these kind of more tree-based understandings. If you're familiar with data science or any computer science, this kind of tree is pretty familiar to you. But while it may be a pretty intuitive tool for understanding something, you pull the thread, you get to the next point and the next point, it kind of inflicts injustice upon the subject a lot of the times, just for the sake of this narrative structure. And this is a kind of epistemic or epistemology being the study of knowledge. It's kind of an epistemic paradigm imposed by the user interface of Wikipedia itself, we think is really inadequate for properly leveraging and understanding the importance of Wikipedia itself. It puts things in the wrong order simply because you start at an article and get to a couple articles further down the road. That doesn't mean that that beginning article was the most important. Or it also means that you can end up in time and attention expensive rabbit holes that don't really take you anywhere. And also you can just miss opportunities. I'm sure a lot of you, everybody here, has opened up dozens and dozens of Wikipedia articles trying to find out information on something. And maybe you don't click the right link and you miss out on a whole part of a topic you're trying to do research on. And so kind of if you think about clicking through Wikipedia over time, you're kind of producing a tree. If you started article A and you click article B and C and so on and so forth, then you end up with this tree through time. But maybe you never clicked on article E, so you missed out on J and K. And those could be really, really useful. Maybe starting at A was a bad point. Maybe actually you needed to go J, E, B, A, C to really understand a concept. We need to kind of ignore the narrative structure of this tree and kind of try to flatten things out. And that's exactly what we try to do with our project, which is called No Edge. We want to apply this rhizomatic model, so no trees. So in the context of No Edge, we want this new paradigm to be called the concept. So instead of just having a bunch of disparate pieces of information that you have open in a bunch of different tabs, we actually want to explore kind of a new dimension that exists on top of those articles. And that's how they relate to one another. We think that this forms a concept. You're able to abstract a dense network of information and then parse the actual relationships that exist between them to draw a new understanding. Because we don't think that understanding is the retention of single pieces of information, but rather an understanding of how they relate to one another. And that's really what we want to accentuate with this tool. We want to enunciate these relationships. A good way to think about this is everybody's favorite mold, the slime mold. So Harvard carried out this cool experiment that I think is just a really nice representation of it, where essentially they had a flat piece of glass and they arranged dots of nutrients out and arranged them in the same way that major urban centers of Tokyo were laid out. Then, because of the kind of rhizomatic botanical operations, mechanical operations of the slime mold, they would search out for nutrients. Some would fail, some would succeed, but eventually they ended up forming a network. It took about 26 hours for them to form what you see on the top there. And you can see it's actually very close to the actual train rail lines that exist in Tokyo. So in 26 hours, this kind of rhizomatic approach that we are calling it, was able to achieve what took hundreds of engineers, dozens of years to accomplish. We think that that's actually a really powerful expression of the importance of expanding outwards and trying all possible directions to go into. So basically, we want to be that slime mold that draws the map. We want to collapse how Wikipedia currently expresses information and enunciate how it relates to one another. So, enough on slime molds, I guess. We can talk about how we actually do this. So what we've built is a tool that parses the entirety of Wikipedia, going back to how open it is. You can download the entirety of Wikipedia in any language you choose. We've downloaded this, parsed through it all, and dumped it into what's called a graph database. For those not familiar, obviously a database is something you store data in, but a graph database is a particular kind of database that lets us tap into some interesting math. It has basically two data types. You have a node that can store information. In our context, it stores the article text itself. And you have relationships. And these relationships would be maybe an article linking to another article. So whenever you have a blue link in Wikipedia, that's a relationship to another node in the graph database. So we've parsed all that out, and it takes quite a long time, but it's really powerful because we can tap into a set of mathematics called graph theory. And this kind of lets us do pathfinding. So if you've ever played the Wikipedia game, where you click on a random article and try and find your way to Kevin Bacon or Jesus Christ or whatever, we think that we've won that game forever. Because not only can we find every possible path between two arbitrary points in this graph, we can find the shortest path. And we can actually take into account a pretty useful piece of metadata, such as which is called weighting. So each relationship we can apply a weight to. And so we can do some either dumb or machine learning advanced semantic analysis to say, oh, this relationship here is really important and is actually more valuable than just I was actually looking and exploring using the tool today, and Karl Marx links directly to Soho, New York City. Probably not a very useful relationship to float to the surface. But essentially, we've parsed it out into these nodes and relationships that we can then do pathfinding on. So you can enter any article A and any ending article B, and it will show you all the possible paths, or the shortest possible paths.
Isn't shortest path NP complete?
Longest path is. Shortest path is I don't believe it's NP complete,
Okay.
but I could be wrong there. It's basically just fancy Chikestras or
Well,
A-star.
and also I'll say whether it is or not, for a suitably powerful computer and a suitably small set, you could brute force the
Yeah, that's
answer.
true, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so basically we think that the cool thing about this data set and producing this graph database is that all the information that we need is already there. We aren't adding any information to Wikipedia. We're just enunciating a dimension of the data that isn't really expressed or useful. You just can't use it. The UI of Wikipedia has one mode, and it's just clicking through links and opening tabs, and it's that tree structure. So you lose out on a lot of understanding. But so we've been thinking a lot about how to express this new dimension of data, and how do you best explore it, and it's a really big answer. It's an even bigger question to ask than, how do you make a graph database like this? That's actually kind of a solved problem with enough time and a powerful enough computer. But yeah, making a tool that concisely, efficiently, and if we want to make something that people actually use, pleasurable tool to use, it's significantly harder. And so we started looking out and trying to find what other people had been doing, and we came across this project, and this is just one of many. There are tons of them. But it's called Wikiverse. And it's very cool, it's very beautiful. We're not the first ones to think of Wikipedia as a graph object. But what we found is that tools like Wikiverse, and there are some others, they're focused on producing technological art, where form is the focus. They basically want to just display, look at how big Wikipedia is. And it's amazing. I highly recommend you check out Wikiverse. It's very, very cool. And they're able to get some cool categorization and group things by domain of knowledge. Not trying to critique them at all, but our focus, we think, is distinct from most other projects, and that we're trying to make something truly useful in order for us to really, so that we can really tap into the power of kind of this rhizomatic map. But that's a really difficult question. There's a lot of information exposed by this new dimension. I mean, already, think about the numbers I was saying in terms of how many articles and words there are in Wikipedia, in English Wikipedia alone. Now we're trying to add even more information. We're trying to explore every possible relationship between every possible article, and then give a user some way to explore that. That's a very difficult problem from a UI and UX perspective. So we kind of decided to look back to kind of the grandfather of information design and data visualization, which is Edward Tufte. He was an American statistician and professor emeritus of political science, statistics, and computer science at Yale University. He's pretty well decorated, but yeah, he's basically the grandfather of all of this. And we think that his works are critical in understanding how to construct a truly useful tool. Or how to design a UI that has the right level of information density to achieve kind of 3 striations of users. We want a 5-second user who just goes and finds a single article, and we give that user the actual Wikipedia page. We think that they're good for that purpose. If you're trying to read a single article, they've done a great job, so we just give them that page. But we also want the 5-minute user who says, I came here for this article, but maybe I want to know, what articles does this article relate to? How can I explore, surrounding neighboring articles? And then we have kind of the 50-minute user, 50-minute plus, I should say. And this is for people that are really trying to do research or build a curriculum so they can teach themselves or teach others or comprehend a relatively large topic that would take them hundreds of tabs to open, and they would get lost, and there's no way to take notes or keep track of things. We want to build a truly useful tool at all of those tiers. So someone like Edward Tufte and his work around visual information design is super important. And really, this design aspect cannot be overstated. The difference between seeing a glob of letters like this and words is basically the fine line that we're trying to toe. And so one thing that I really like that he said is that graphics should be as intelligent and sophisticated as the accompanying text. The way in which we present this information has to be just as smart and concise as the underlying information it's representing. And I think a great example of this from one of his books is this map it's a weather map that was printed in I believe a newspaper in Japan. But you can see that along the x-axis, you have a kind of a profile topographical view of Japan. And going down on the y-axis, you have the weather for that day with little notes in Japanese, which I don't know. But then going up on the y-axis, you have wind patterns at different elevations. And going further up, you kind of see what kind of clouds are expected to form at what area. So this is a really great compact expression where every possible visual dimension is leveraged. So it's very concise, it's also approachable and simple. And notably, it avoids something that Edward Tufte really despised, which he called chart junk. He said that the interior decoration of graphics generates a lot of ink that does not tell the viewer anything new. The purpose of decoration varies, to make the graphic appear more scientific and precise, to enliven the display, or to give the designer an opportunity to exercise artistic skills. Regardless of this cause, it is all non-data ink or redundant data ink and is often chart junk. So our approach, it kind of follows this. We try and be very minimal, make sure that every single visual element tells the user something new that they didn't know before or isn't available anywhere else in the interface. And I know this is EFF-Austin, so I figured I'd throw this slide in. I am a sysadmin and DevOps engineer, so I live in a terminal. I'm accessing a lot of servers that I did not set up. These servers can be running different operating systems, have different hardware, be running different programs, be under different load, different security requirements, all sorts of things. But there is a consistent user interface guideline and philosophy called incurses available in Linux that is able to tackle this wide variety of servers in a very effective way. And there's a reason for this. So as you can see here, before I dive too deep, you basically have, this is what you would see in a terminal, and it's expressing all sorts of information. So you can see memory usage, CPU usage over time, more stats about memory, kernel stats, disk input and output, CPU utilization, virtual memory, all sorts of information is presented only using text, and every element of that text is used and it actually expresses something. And I think that that's the beautiful thing about incurses, is that it treats text as the primary element. And the reason that that's important is because you don't know what kind of server you're dealing with. It may not have the power to render some JavaScript web page. It may not even be running a graphical server. You may not be able to pull up a single window that we're used to dealing with. It could just only be able to render text. So that's kind of the unifying element there. And a bunch of applications have deployed some, what I find to be very beautiful interfaces, ultimately, that are just super concise, focused on substance rather than form, and really, I don't know if you guys have ever watched a sysadmin or a really savvy engineer use a computer, but like the amount of things they're able to accomplish in a short amount of time is awesome. It's because of concise interfaces that are driven by things like hotkeys instead of digging through menus and things like that. And it taps again into Edward Tufte. He kind of agrees, at least I think he would. He wants to make all visual distinctions as subtle as possible, but still clear and effective. Relevant to nearly every display of data, the smallest effective difference is the Occam's razor of information design. And often, the happy consequence of an economy of means is a graceful richness of information. For small differences allow for more differences. And so, trying to take all of his work and my obsession, sorry Adam, our UI engineer with text-based interfaces, is basically how do we take that and apply it to this rhizomatic map of Wikipedia. The contrast on this screen is not great, but that's just a fancy display of a bunch of different types of paths that can exist between nodes. So we basically have to ask ourselves, what kind of relationships in this new dimension of information on Wikipedia do we want to float to the user, and how do we express them visually? Taking the philosophy of Edward Tufte and minimal design, avoiding chart junk, things like that, and how do we make that something useful? Because currently Wikipedia has one tool, and that tool is a hammer, so every problem looks like a nail. And we think that there's a variety of information that needs to be expressed. So I'm going to show you guys some actual screenshots from our project and kind of how we decided to categorize things and how we think users will use them. So the first approach is what we call the bloom, because it emanates out from a central point. So you go to Wikipedia, for example, or rather you go to NoEdge, and you type in a single article, and it will plop in the center. I don't know if you guys can read it, but the thing with the blue lines emanating from it is epistemology, oddly enough. And so you can see on the right side, it gives a little pull-out window that actually displays the Wikipedia page for that. So you can always access that information from Wikipedia itself. But you can also see other articles that are linked to it, and they kind of emanate out. So the first 6 things that surround it in this hexagonal concentric pattern are the first links that are linked to by that article, and it kind of expands outward and outward. We do impose limits on how many layers we go recursively, just for hardware purposes, because hosting this database can be expensive. And if you don't know what recursion is, I recommend you learn what recursion is. But the next view, we think that this is kind of intended to be something that drives curiosity. So this is when you want to go and you just want to explore. You want to find new topics, new articles that relate to this topic you know you want to start on. So this is really just intended to be that 5-second user view that can be quite exploratory. As you can see, I drug my mouse down, diagonally down to the right and then over one. And so it draws this little path. And then what you can do is once you have highlighted a path that you want or entered a second article into that text box on the top right, you get to what we think is kind of the bread and butter of the whole operation, which is the discrete path view. This actually displays the shortest path between two articles. And we think that people will be spending a lot of time in this view. And this is, we're still in a private beta stage, so there's going to be a lot of things added to this to express this information, but this is all operating on real data. So you're able to just immediately pick two articles and find the shortest path between them. And is that a hand, or did you want to?
Yeah.
Sure.
What's the difference between that discrete path and the previous one?
The difference? So that's actually not the shortest path that I've highlighted. So that's actually, I just dragged my mouse. So as you move your mouse to any other little node or article, it will draw you the path that it's displaying. So how you would get from the initial article to that article is by hopping through those
So
articles.
you just dragged from the first to the last, you didn't touch the other ones?
Correct.
And it did it for you?
Correct. Correct. And then this is as if I had typed in a second article. It shows me the shortest path between those two. So we think that this is really cool. This is you're immediately presented with 3 articles that you can read individually, or that you can then maybe pull on a longer path. And this kind of takes us to the next logical step of abstracting one layer further, which is if you have a single path, you may want to have a multi-path. And we're still working on some of these because you get into some interesting problems. But if you can imagine, you take one of those discrete paths, and let's say it's a little longer than just 3 nodes. If you had multiple paths between the same 2 articles, so let's say that you have articles A and E, and there are 10 paths between them that you care about. You want to be able to display all of those paths in a nice clean way by maybe stacking a bunch of discrete paths. But interestingly enough, you may have paths within each path that interact with one another. And so this, we think, is where we really start approaching that rhizomatic level of thinking. We can understand not only a single path between A and article E, but actually how all the paths in between, all the possible paths, interact with one another. Because it may be that there's a subpath between A and E that hits the Industrial Revolution article, and 7 out of 10 of those paths all weave through it. That's probably a pretty important article for you to understand if you're really trying to understand A and E as a unified whole. And so we think that there's a lot of work to be done here that can really bring out some potent information. And so zooming out one layer further, once again, apologies to Adam. This is going to be a nightmare for him to try and arrange into a usable design. But I love railroad maps, and I think the next view is a multiplex. So this is, I call it a multiplex because calling it a multi-multipath sounds bad. But basically, the goal here is to, basically, if you've got A to E, and you have all the multiple paths in between those 2 nodes, let's say that you also have C to G, and you have all the multiple paths between those. And then you also have W to Z, and all the multiple paths there. If you want to view them all those multi-paths at a single time, there could very well be interactions between all of those possible paths. And you zoom out even further, and you start to understand a very potentially broad concept that could have a lot of interactions in it. And it kind of gets a little overwhelming, but we think that something like a rail map is actually pretty cohesive in terms of expressing this effectively to the end user. So this is Frankfurt in particular, but you could kind of imagine all the paths interacting with one another, maybe going through cities or articles, and forming this cohesive map so that you can understand, like, for example, oh hey, so here's this multipath that's got 4 paths going over here, another multipath that's got 2 paths, and they intersect each other, and they actually run along for a little while, and all touch on the same articles. And we think that exposing that information, you can see that this is actually, these all share similar topics, even though they aren't going to the same place at all. Their beginning point and their end point are actually unrelated until you understand what exists between them.
But that's essentially taking all of the paths together and just treating them as a graph, right?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, so that's what we've done, is we basically dumped the entirety of Wikipedia into a graph database.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you just take the subset and take, given 2 nodes, take all the paths which are under some length, because obviously if you unbound the length, then then you'll just get basically the whole graph.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of the bird's eye view. So you can see the intersection of multiple multipaths and start to understand interrelationships between what you formerly believed to be discrete concepts. So we have a lot of information clearly presented in the multiplex, and this is something that we're working towards in addition to the multipath. There's a lot of, like I said, making the UI useful is our primary goal here, and that's very, very difficult to do. So I guess the question there, or the question here after this is, where do we go from here? Like, what are our focuses right now? I've shown you that we have the Bloom view, the discrete path view. We have something that's able to dump this data into a graphing database. We're working on weighting relationships based on semantics and doing things like that. The first thing we want to do is explore feedback from beta testers. So we're going to open up the private beta to you guys today. You're going to be the first batch of people. I'll take down your email, and you'll be able to get through the little gateway, start playing with the tool, probably bring it down, and I will lose some sleep, but that's okay.
That's what beta's about.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So first and foremost, we want to start collecting data on beta users. Oh no, I forgot where we're going from here. Benjamins. The other thing that we really want to do, and this is tapping back to what I mentioned, was really get intelligent weighting of relationships. Because Wikipedia has a lot of information, and not all of it is what we want to be floating to the user. This is the Karl Marx to Soho thing in a single click. Like you probably will never want to actually use that relationship. I would challenge you on that.
What if I'm reading about the difference engine and there's the communist commune of Manhattan of Karl Marx and the ultimate history?
There you go.
Are you on Wikipedia right now?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just challenge accepted.
Sounds good. I've got 5 on it. I want a short-term paper.
Are you guys looking at stuff to do with like text similarity and text embeddings? So you could like weigh the arcs by some sort of similarity?
Yeah, so we think there's kind of 2 approaches to doing this. There's like a dumb or classical computing way, and then there's like a machine learning way that gets closer to what you're describing, I think. And there's some obvious short-term, small amounts of work that can yield big benefits, such as if an article or if a relationship between 2 articles is bidirectional. So if article A links to article B and article B links back to article A, that's clearly a pretty valuable relationship. And then you can do like word histograms and compare them, see how many they share, a frequency table, things like that. And so those are kind of the dumb ways. And then I can't even talk to the smart ways. The man in the red beard in the back can. And he will be the one kind of heading that up. But we definitely want to build up on intelligent weighting of relationships. We also really need to work, we also really need to work on the UI for the multipath. The multiplex is something that probably won't be for a while, but we need to get the multipath working, because exploring those shared paths between multiple discrete paths, I think is going to be really, really valuable. And
what language/framework are you writing the visualization stuff in?
I was just about to say, we also need front-end developers. So,
It's D3 in React, and
Yeah.
Shelby, who's been doing most of the front-end development, gets back from New York next week.
yeah, so we're using D3 and React for all the rendering stuff on the front end. We do have a front-end developer, but I think that we need a small army of them. And so we actually have kind of a track here with a good friend of mine. Basically, to give you guys an idea of like kind of the target audience for this, once we have a stable beta with the multipath working, we want to be able to work with universities and libraries and university libraries to actually set this up in public. Because we think that would be kind of a useful thing. I personally think it's silly that libraries don't have cool ways of interacting with Wikipedia. Like, libraries should love Wikipedia, and they probably do, but they don't really have an effective means of exerting that besides just having a computer with Wikipedia on it.
Do you guys currently have any contacts at the UT School of Information or not?
I work at UT.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I was going to say, I do have like Phil Doty's email somewhere in my Robodex. I don't know if he'd reply, but I do have it somewhere.
Yeah, I work there, and then I sit on a library committee.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
He said Rolodex.
Yeah, I can be analog sometimes.
Yeah. So one feature in addition, and then I'm kind of going to open it up to Q&A. But one thing that we really want to do is kind of not just express to people here are their relationships, but we want to, in targeting the research audience, we want to have like kind of a rich metadata annotation engine, so that at any level, from the Bloom view, the single path, the multipath, you can actually take annotations and leave notes on particular relationships that you can then save to maybe a user system, which we're trying to make as frictionless as possible, but also to be able to share it with other people and have them collaborate on, if you're doing a big research and you're dealing with a big multi-path and you're like, this is the information I need, we want people to be able to highlight parts of Wikipedia, leave notes on relationships, reference other articles on a relationship, do all sorts of rich annotations that they can then share with others or use to generate a presentation, something like that. But we think that annotating these relationships is, you know, a great way of being able to document what all that you've learned from seeing them. And then also, and this is the last thing I'm going to bring up before, you know, thanking the team and everything, but one thing that we really think is super useful about No Edge is the rhizomatic approach. As I was talking about in the beginning, this is why we think what we're doing is productive. And we want to expand that to different data sets. We think that Wikipedia is an amazing beginning point that captures a lot, but we think that basically every single science journal or science publication house has similarly capable knowledge underneath it that's hidden because there's no way of understanding how they relate to one another. So if you were to try and dig through an academic paper and you wanted to do more research, you would have to go find the references, click the references. This is after you get through a paywall. And then you'd have to click through that reference, find the primary text, click the reference, go through. And we think that we could start with something like Archive, which is another open source science publication that's actually super important, started at Los Alamos, which is where the internet kind of got started. But yeah, super incredible publication that we want to build this same layer of tooling for. Yeah, that opens it up to a lot of different things. So before I do that, I want to thank the team, everybody that's been a part of this. We got Stephen Wilkinson, he's our data scientist. We got Adam Ziner, D-Ziner, which is pretty great, who helps us, you know. And then we've got myself, I'm a back-end engineer, and we have Shelby Wilson, who's currently in New York. She's our front-end engineer. And I just wanted to thank you guys for tolerating my random rants about French philosophers.
That's the best part.
So yeah, with that, I'm going to open it up to QA, and then afterwards I'll be taking signups on the laptop.
Questions?
Yeah, I have a dumb question. I apologize, I was late. Could
Sure.
you remind me who you guys are, and did you share a thing to your presentation?
I will definitely share a link to this presentation. We are called No Edge. So
No
like knowledge, but instead of an L, it's a backslash.
I think
Oh, the time of the talk. Got it.
Yeah.
And
Alright.
I think that ties into a question I actually had from Nash at EFF. He was wondering, is there a place on the web to go learn more about the project yet?
Yes, we need to add an about page to the website, but currently we're focused on getting the private sign up. But yes, I will send that to you, and you can
Yeah,
update the meeting link or something.
Yeah, you know, I'll put in our Facebook group and in the event or the meetup stuff, any info he shares with me about the project, I'll forward it along to people.
Except for passwords. But yeah.
Except for passwords.
I have two questions. One is, you haven't spoken much about your organization and what sort of model it is. It
Sure.
is like open source, or are you a
Yeah.
commercial entity?
Yeah, we think that it's this is kind of a passion project is a weird way to put it, but this is very much an open source project. We want to stay in line with the values of Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation. The best, in terms of a business model, I don't know that we really have articulated one yet. It's not going to be ads or anything like that. It would be great to be acquired by Wikimedia, but I don't know what that looks like.
Right.
But this is an open source project, and I'll include links to the
So
GitHub.
at the
and
moment, you're
everything.
not a for-profit company.
And,
No.
and
No.
question two, this of course being an EFF meetup, you have the potential to gather a lot of information about individuals. What is your privacy policy as far as that goes? Because people's activity might say a lot about them.
Sure. I don't actually think that is true. I don't think we have many mechanisms for collecting data, and the user system that we're working on is actually one that would be incredibly minimal. It will not be storing all of that data, and we're trying to play a lot with like shareable hash links that are kind of always public, and that's kind of the model that we're going for. Is we don't want to be storing a bunch of people's data. That is absolutely not our goal. We want to provide the functionality, kind of like Craigslist. Like,
Yeah.
do they really have a user system, or is it just like you get emailed a private link that's only usable, and it basically deflects the question of security to your email provider? And that's a pattern that like Mozilla adopted for some of their services, and
Well, that's something just a
Yeah.
question you might want to
For sure.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. We absolutely need to be very open about that, because that is definitely not our goal.
You might though want to track people's long-term paths, because that might give you good information about how different pages relate, right? If you know this
Yeah.
is user X and this is the same user X you saw, if you see their life history, so all the different paths they've taken through Wikipedia, that could be very useful to actually.
Yeah, and I
I
really
mean, if you ever got to the point that there are actually user accounts for the service, you know, that
correct.
might be
That is
something
something
to
that's down the road for us.
Right.
Now
You
it's
can
just a
do that with
completely
cookies
open
too,
tool.
right?
Yeah.
Just to point out, as Daniel said at the last meetup here, you were the dude who did the energy talk, that based on energy data, they can tell when you're having sex. You did say that.
I do not think we're collecting enough metadata to define that.
Unless you're
But-
searching for how you have sex.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, you could probably detect people planning to have sex.
Yeah, yeah. And the shortest path to it.
I mean, searches, you can speculate what the overall research project is, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe define that.
Yeah.
So,
Early on in the talk, you talked about like losing Alexandria and a lot of the history that is lost for a certain time period, and how Wikipedia can be one of the most important resources for this era.
Mhm.
The good thing about wikis are that they have change history.
Right.
Is that another dimension that you plan on exploring in the graph? Like, I'm thinking about
Yes.
you remember the Reddit April Fool's Day thing where you could do pixel art?
Yeah, like the $1 million
Yeah,
homepage.
and then they made a GIF of how it changed throughout the day.
Right.
So there were entire sections that just got completely obliterated and covered over by the end of the day.
Yeah.
So if you just have a snapshot of where it is now, that doesn't necessarily show you the entire history of what has happened. So
Right. Actually, I think a way that I've thought about this that is not on like our feature roadmap because it's like pretty intensive. But one thing I thought was like during pretty much every political event, Wikipedia pages become hotspots for editing. So you have basically competing. It's a geopolitical site basically of who can have their information stay up the longest and get past the editors. And I think showing like an edit heat map of articles over time and what changes, like in a Git diff, if you guys are familiar with that, or just like what particular lines have been changed, and then how they coincide with political events would be a super interesting thing to look
And
at.
then on the multiplex topic,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to have, I guess, some sort of pattern recognition on how various articles are changed by various kind of connected parties, you may be able to see like propaganda efforts.
Yeah.
That sort of thing, and
Yeah.
train a model on detecting organized, like trying to subvert the editors, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, one, well, I don't want to go too deep into this so we can get to other questions, but a big area I've thought about wanting to do this as well, and then I realized that no news media actually cites their sources, but it's like making a map of that and trying to build like a truthiness gauge, if you guys are fans of Stephen Colbert, but like basically trying to see who's citing what and where they're drawing these conclusions from. But I feel like that's a distinct enough tool from this topic of trying to, make a fake news detector, basically, is kind of out of scope for us. But it's super fascinating, and I think when you start thinking in this way, and it's kind of to the point, is like when you start thinking in this way about how not just an individual article exists in a vacuum, but how they relate to one another over time, there's a lot of useful information there that's kind of latent, that is, in my opinion, currently ignored. We'll start right to left here, if that's cool. Or my right, yeah.
Oh, okay. The balloon,
Mhm.
if I understand that right, the central node is the article or the topic that you've typed in or that you've chosen to start from.
Mhm.
And then you've got like first level links and then links off of those. Is that how that works?
Mhm.
How is that built? Because
Hmm.
there's no article on Wikipedia. I would question whether there's any article that has 6 links or less.
Right.
So how are you building, like how are you choosing what those links are?
So until we have enough confidence in our relationship weighting engine,
Yeah.
we basically get all of the emanating paths from the central node. We get all of them, and then we trim them down to just like a finite set, because we can't display them all, or we approach the wiki first level. So we just kind of say, grab the first 6, and then for the second layer, grab the first, I think it's 3 or 2, and just kind of trim it out over time. That's because we don't have a very robust weighting engine at the moment.
Okay,
But
so
once
at
we
the
do,
moment I mean, I don't mean this.
It's
in a
kind of
negative
dumb.
way,
No,
but right
it's
now
rather
just
dumb.
kind of arbitrary, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, the
Um,
first step on that will be context
Well,
weighting.
but it's
Okay.
always a hard problem.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, like, I mean, you're saying like not many articles are gonna have more than 6 links, but a lot of articles are gonna just have like so many more links, it's gonna get really difficult.
No, yeah, what I said was, there are no articles with 6 links or less.
Yeah.
Like,
that's what I'm
everything
saying.
is gonna have
I'm thinking
more
that, I
than
mean,
that.
it's probably a lot higher than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you get 4 layers deep on that, and you try to put that in one display.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys looked at PageRank-like algorithms for that? So you basically just calculate flow, you know, you calculate everything that's within radius 2, then compute some kind of a flow, or some sort of a conserved flow over all the links following the link direction, and then display the highest flowing links.
So I would defer that question over to Steve. If you want to talk to him after, yeah.
And we're
It's on my-
really excited
it's on
about
my
that
list.
direction.
Okay. Yeah, and then I think I wanted to keep this order going. And did you also have a question?
Yeah, I
You
just
want a
wanted,
shower,
so when you talk about expanding it to things like archive, there was a project that was done a few years ago called Brain Scanner by,
Brain scanner?
fellow, Brad Wojtek and his wife, his first name I don't remember, at UCSD, and they're kind of data science and neuroscience people, so they ingested, many thousands of neuroscience articles and built basically kind of a word cloud interface for navigating that stuff. And
Gotcha.
it was online for a while, sadly it's broken now, but he just published an article about it and long blog post where it's kind of explaining some pictures of it and stuff, so it's kind of.
It's called Brain Scanner, you said?
Brain Scanner, I think one word without an E before the last R.
Classic.
I guess we can,
Cool. Yeah, I'll look, this isn't my laptop, otherwise I would be typing this down.
well, you
But
can't bring it up now, but it's something that's close, and I think he's, one of the things that he's promoted too is that you'll actually, find perhaps like research subjects, like these things come close enough, or there's enough overlap between them, that somebody ought to look at the relationship between this thing and this other thing. So it's kind of like
Gotcha.
idea generation, which
Right.
your abstract actually sounded like you guys were going in that direction a little bit, but I didn't see it in the talk so much.
yeah, I think you could definitely find and discover holes in Wikipedia where there's not enough information. But our goal is not currently to add to Wikipedia, but to expose a dimension of data that Wikipedia doesn't currently express. But I think in the context of something like science, that would be super useful. Like, oh, we have all these articles, or these papers that kind of dance around this topic. Maybe there's something missing from it. I think could be, for discovering areas of potential research, I think would be super valuable.
Oh, and just to quickly sidebar here, but since it's kind of relevant, you talk about wanting to extend this to potentially like the citation graph of scientific papers, but the difficulty of dealing with things like paywalls and whatnot. Are you familiar with a project called Sci-Hub?
Yep.
So Sci-Hub is a project that was founded in 2011 by Alexandra Elbakian in Kazakhstan. She's basically pulling an Aaron Schwartz, basically, where she is taking millions of scientific articles and posting on this site with no regard to paywall or copyrights.
I think I have heard of this. Yeah.
And,
there was another one that was for.
I mean, it's Pirate Bay for scientific papers.
Yeah.
Where exactly it's hosted jumps around because they keep trying to shut it down.
The
But
Hydra.
if you needed a corpus of millions of non-paywall scientific articles, I'd check that out.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Only
Thank you.
Kazakhstan.
Right.
Well, that's
So
what
offer
big
it
games are
down.
for. Now I'm in Kazakhstan.
One more thing that might be interesting about BrainScan is it is not actually built by following citation links, it's actually built by looking at the content.
Word. Yeah.
And they actually did something called like the connectome of the human brain, where they basically said like what brain region should be connected based on the information that's in the articles, and it's a very good match.
Oh wow. Kind of like the slime mold making the rail map. That's wild. And then in the rain jacket.
In a red shirt?
Oh, rain jacket.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it looks it looks weatherproof, I assume.
Okay, yeah. So I had 2 questions, one about money and the other about waiting.
Great.
So money, are you guys funded to work full time on this right now?
No.
So I was thinking that like I'm working on an app right now. I don't actually really code myself, but I'm paying somebody. And like I think something like this would be very useful to my app actually, like because like so many things are tree structured on the internet. Period. And actually, not even on just on the internet, but it would like my app particularly is like a health and wellness related app, and like it's like people search like their symptoms, and then for the symptoms, like treatments come up, like that are like based on user data, like what's the most effective. And anyways, like there's very much like we have it model set up, so it's a tree relationship. But I can imagine that there would be a lot more useful ways. And all that's to say that like maybe once you guys have a good proof of concept, you could actually, you know, lose your ideals a little bit and like work with some companies that want to improve the product.
Yeah, I think that the nice thing, and this is kind of something I was trying to express with that graph database slide, is that the tech of building a graph database and finding all this pathfinding stuff is largely done. It's just about data wrangling and getting it in the right format so the graph database can actually handle it. So it'd be really trivial to port something like your data set over to a graph database. The difficulty is expressing it in a useful way and designing the UI around it, because it's kind of an overwhelming amount of information. And in terms of losing our ideals, I think that our focus right now is to be used by research for research. And so, once we get a nice beta up and running, we definitely want to follow this connection that we have and potentially get into some universities in London and some libraries in London that are kind of new media savvy. And we want to pull that thread for as long as we can and kind of, ideally catch the eye of a community. I don't foresee even like thinking in a very capitalistic sellout kind of way. The only real outlet or productive model I see is ads. I'm sorry?
The Ellen Institute?
I don't know what that is.
They're the guys who, not Google Scholar, but if you looked at Semantic Scholar, they're the guys like, Ellen is one of the Microsoft founders, right? Paul Ellen,
Yeah.
and he is a big AI buff, and he has like a whole AI institute, and one of the things is that one of their products is like the the Semantic Scholar.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of what our goal is right now, is not so much raising capital or anything like that to sell a product, but seeking out grant opportunities for this kind of.
Them and Zuckerberg Chan have a thing going as well.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Meta.ai, I believe.
What was it?
Meta.ai, I think.
Matter.ai.
Meta.
Oh, gotcha.
Meta.ai.
Cool. Yeah, and these are all things that I wish I had my laptop instead of this one so I could write them down. But I'm going to do my best to remember, and I might come up to you afterwards and ask for a repetition of it.
I also wanted to ask you about the weighting.
Mhm.
So, I mean, you thought about weighting in terms of looking at, I guess, paths and links, and also in terms of semantics. But why not make it optional, or like an opt-in thing that your metadata can be tracked as a user, and like because like you're missing out on like intelligent decisions from human beings. Like if I'm starting an article and trying to get to, I have some idea of like the conceptual journey I want to take.
Yeah.
I might click on one article and be like, no, that's totally useless. I'm going back. All right, then I click on this article. It's useful. I'm going to go deeper here.
Yeah, and I think that I don't think that we necessarily want to close the door of like an opt-in method for like make my annotations on this relationship public. Like if you're like, I'm a learned person and my knowledge doesn't really fit into either of these articles, it fits on the kind of interstitial space between them, and like I don't see a reason why we wouldn't want people to be able to add to it just like you would with Wikipedia, with the same privacy policy and expectation
Well, I think
of
he's
openness.
also talking about, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, like user tracking and that kind of thing.
Yeah, because
I just feel like, I don't know, like what kind of useful vectors would you try and get from that?
And I am like 60% through a book about true crime right now, so I apologize for using this as an example.
Yeah.
H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, was also prolific at insurance fraud. So hypothetically, people visiting his Wikipedia page could be looking for information about serial killers or insurance fraud.
Right.
And based on your user history, is someone like me, if I went to that page and you were tracking my user history, your relevant links that pop up around in these peripheral articles, you would know from my data and tracking me, if I consented to that, of course,
Right.
you would know I'm going to want relevant articles about true crime, serial killers, things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas someone else who's maybe studying insurance fraud or wants to be a claims adjuster, something to that effect, would show them a completely different set of peripheral articles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be like a very difficult problem for us to solve with our current team, just speaking frankly, and also something that I think is like, I feel, there is useful information everywhere, and it's about picking the right battles and picking the most productive points of information to find things on. So not to speak and say, no, there's no useful information there, but I think it would introduce a lot of ethical challenges for us that
Definitely.
may not be the most productive thing for us to focus on. at the moment.
Well,
We were-
so there's a difference between what I'm talking about and what he's talking about, and they're
Okay.
both useful. He's talking about personalization, I'm talking about aggregation.
Mhm.
Like, I'm talking about, you see that a bunch of people are following a certain path.
Yeah.
That's very simple.
Sure.
That's not my information, I don't like.
Right,
that's
sure,
not
in
my-
aggregation, I think that,
I agree.
but
Well,
is that
I guess-
information,
I guess I will say, just giving, because I follow this stuff somewhat, that could potentially be useful, but you have to be very careful. If all you're logging is, the pure number of people who followed a path, the number and nothing else, that doesn't really present very many privacy concerns. If there are any data points associated with it, you need shockingly few data points to reverse engineer somebody's unique identity. Like, you'd be
Yeah.
shocked how few you need.
Yeah.
So you'd really have to limit it to just
the number.
like
Well, and this would-
100,000 people traverse this and you know nothing else about them.
That would-
right,
that
and we would
be
have to
very
strip it all of PII and like try
Well,
and strive to be
And
like
then
GDPR
the act of surfacing those paths, like, further reinforces the popularity of those paths.
Exactly, so you get into this like
That's-
statistical
In
question.
that case, but like,
There would have
it's
to be a
useful
certain amount of
information, but it's part of like, somebody touched on like whether we were gonna dig into the history, right? Like, the first thing is to tackle the space problem, and then we link time, right? Like, we
Yeah.
have to tackle the two-dimensional problem.
Yeah.
But then like, as soon as we have that in hand, then we can turn things sideways and see what's under it, right? And then we get history, we get all this temporal data. So like, once we engage that system, what you're talking about will emerge naturally out of that. Like, where people are, like, where the path is well trodden, that will be surfaced, just as a
Wait, how does it do with
Like the
history?
slime.
Huh?
Exactly.
He's
It always
saying
comes back to
pages-
slime ball.
Pages that have had large edit histories implicitly imply what you're talking about.
Not necessarily, edit or view history.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those would be inputs, like, those would be inputs into the weighting engine, right?
Yeah. So to the point, and I think that you were saying that there's similar points, is that I think that there is valuable information in there, but it's definitely, I wouldn't say a focus of ours right now on how a user. The only way that we really care about users using it is whether or not they actually like it and how effective it is for them. So trying to stay as away from introducing additional information as we can, and just using the information that's already there. Like you were saying, we've got to solve the space, and then maybe time, and then maybe users over space and time. Maybe the third dimension there. I think, Dom, did you have a question?
I think you kind of covered it there, because my question had to do with whether you would reapply this to a geographical map of how ideas spread, but I think that could also be used in like marketing, and
Right.
then also like feed back into itself. But I think it would be really interesting to see how certain ideas spread, like.
Yeah. Well, and Wikipedia does track, I believe, if you don't have a user login, it uses your IP as your identity there. And so assuming you aren't using a VPN, which I'm sure there's a percentage that are, you could already map the edit history of an article geographically. And that could be super interesting, and it's something that I think, something like a university library would love to have displays of up. So yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Like a heat map, the spatial heat map, even of an article. Like I remember, one thing that I particularly remember was there was an uprising in Syria, and the Wikipedia article was like exploding, and they had to lock it within like, I think it was like less than an hour of some major news story coming out, because it was just such a hotbed of interaction and all over the world. And someone actually did do an analysis of the IP addresses of the editors, and most of it was coming from Russia. It's like a pretty interesting geopolitical little
I'm
thing,
shocked,
all
actually.
via Wikipedia as like a means of
Honestly shocked.
interpreting this information. Maybe they weren't, honestly, or maybe
Yeah, maybe it's
another
traffic.
actor was routing their traffic. Like there is no way to really know. Hi, I'm Vladimir Putin. I edit Wikipedia.
Have you started, so on the multi-flex
I like this name is evolving and I love it.
What?
The multi-flex.
Works?
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. Let's do it.
Why not?
It's a working title. We can call it whatever.
What about
Have you started using or creating your own terminology for the groupings of those trunk lines?
The
In
only
the early part of the talk, you said, okay, so we're basically servicing entire concepts
Yeah.
out of many pages.
Mhm.
Do you call them concepts? Like, what is your
I think the smallest, I think the smallest example of a concept is the discrete path, a single path, and then the more you zoom out into the higher levels of like a multipath and then a multi-path or a multi-flex, you get basically a more robust understanding of that concept. So we don't have individual terms for like the intensity or the robustness of a concept, but more just how you're looking at it. Because ultimately you're always looking at the same data set, you're just looking at a subset of it. So you can traverse up in complexity and down in complexity and achieve different levels of understanding. Like if you were a bird hunting for prey, like how close you're flying to the ground.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Because I mean, at some point it's, the forest.
Right.
And then the further you get out, it becomes, a tree or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that we have a particular word for it beyond just like bloom, discrete path, and maybe we need to come up with some more consistent, easy
Clustering,
terminology.
I think, and like your zoom level affects like the grain of the cluster,
Yeah.
Is it something that we have all agreed upon?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And you're tapping into
Just 'cause we
some
haven't had
tension
a
here.
discussion yet. It doesn't-
We all hate jargon though, so it'll be easy.
Yeah.
Wait, jargon is the name of the term?
Yes.
Yes. But we hate it. We're not about it, yeah.
On this subject of potentially working with companies in the future.
Yeah.
You mentioned open source. What does open source mean? Is this a GPL share alike style license, or is it an MIT public domain style license, or?
We are likely going with MIT.
Okay.
Is how we're thinking about it. We would love to get more feedback on like what people think would be the best way to go there. But basically we're just trying to be as open as we can and adopt the same ethical mentality of it being ultimately editable, changeable, shareable. We don't think that.
Can you tell us what that means? I'm not sure does that mean that I have to keep it open source? Like, does that mean I have to make my whole app open source?
That's
the
a
question.
GPL.
Yeah, so that would be the
style
difference
license.
between GPL and MIT.
Domain style license is attribution.
Okay.
So as
Using
long,
commercial.
and
Yeah.
I can't plagiarize,
Right.
but I can do anything else with it that I wanted to in the example that they're,
And
it seems that they're most likely
Does it-
considering.
Yeah, does anyone in the room have any reason that they look for GPL and non-MIT style license? Yeah? Like.
So, specifically the AGPL,
Okay,
the Faro
okay.
GPL.
What's the difference in that one?
So the AGPL, basically, it's designed for SaaS companies. So
Okay.
basically, if you have an open source piece of code and you modify that piece of code and you run it on your cloud service,
Yeah.
you still have to release those modifications. So it's a much more aggressive version of the GPL that is adaptive to cloud services.
Whoa.
So
Do you have
that's
to
why
ins-
I like it, but then I'm in an EFF meetup, so.
Right. Well, so wait, what if you get like into a situation where you have some amount of vendor lock-in? How do you disclose that?
So
vendor
that's
lock-in?
where you get into like the library based, like if I have some library, some Python library, some facial recognition library, whatever, right? And it's AGPL, and I just run it on my server and I, use the API as it's designed. I'm
Mhm.
just using the API to interface with it. I'm not modifying the actual code base for the library itself.
Mhm.
So I don't have to release any of my other server code. Now, if I go in and I patch and modify that library, if I run it for a production-facing system, so that other people actually use it through my website,
Mhm.
I have to publish the changes that I've made to that library.
But does that
So
mean
that's
like
it is the most aggressive version of copyleft
Gotcha.
as far as like the license, but
right?
anyway, it's pretty rare that you see that nowadays. Usually it's GPL, in which case it's only if you actually sell the code on a piece of
As
disk
a
or actually
As a
distribute
binary,
it.
basically.
If
Yeah.
you run it on your server, you can modify it however you want.
It's not for
And-
just making it publicly available.
Yeah, that's not distribution in the GPL sense. So usually like MIT and GPL, if you're running a hosted environment, it doesn't really matter.
Although I will say that the really efficient part of the programming me, who hates the billions of dollars our industry has wasted reinventing the wheel 30 times, loves the license.
I know, I love it.
Yeah.
It's great.
GPL.
I will say there are, depending on, what kind of flexibility you want for yourselves in this project in the future,
Mhm.
whatever license you choose today, you could change the license in the future, but I'll be obviously that isn't
Right.
retroactive, you know, so kind of whatever's out now would be subject to that previous license. But,
Yeah.
Again, going back to the earlier, question or discussion, if you did GPL, it's got some advantages today, some moral or ethical advantages to making sure that the code is maintained and remains open source, but still gives you the option of offering it under a separate commercial license if you
Right.
want to work with a company that wants to integrate it into another app or system, without open sourcing the whole thing, you know, so, you would have that flexibility, I guess.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think that the license question is something that's come up before, and we haven't really made a solid decision on yet. So it's really good to hear some feedback on that from this community in particular.
And if anybody has anything like they kind of think about, like we're really leaning heavily toward MIT Apache, something that's pretty commercially permissive. If you have any like impassioned argument against doing that, feel free to share that. You know, it seems like that's a trend in the open source world. Things are going to more commercially permissive
Yeah.
licenses, just in general. I do get that this is the EFF meetup, and I'm not hacker delight, so.
I mean, as long as you're not talking about total closed source proprietary breaking all the standards,
Yes.
I don't think any of
Yeah.
us will torch you alive or something.
I mean,
Definitely
from
not.
my perspective, I'm not really an expert on all these different types of open source, but I mean, as a user, like he said, like if I reliably know something is open source, even though I can't read the code, that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
And even for proprietary things, like I think it's was it Skype that recently announced they were going to use the Signal protocol?
Cool.
I mean, obviously it's something you have to opt in because of Microsoft, but you can create encrypted calls in Skype using the Signal protocol, and that makes me feel a little better knowing that if for some god-awful reason I had to use Skype, that option exists, and that's something that I trust.
And
So I mean, as you, with this product, if you were to go forward with an open source thing, and other companies were to start using your source
Yeah.
code, that's
Yeah.
something that would make me feel a little better about those
I'm hearing like
Yeah,
open
we're-
protocols are important, like
Yeah.
auditability of code is important.
Well, and certainly if you guys, who it sounds like you really are concerned about user privacy and guaranteeing people's privacy using this tool, that's another thing open source gives you.
Yeah.
I don't have to take you at your word that the
Totally.
code's not spying on me. I know it's not
Yeah.
spying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing is you might consider that, I mean, it's probably more relevant to, your situation right now is not so much what users think, but if you start collaborating with universities, they probably have more policy about that.
Right, exactly. So we kind of, and I know that GPL in particular can be kind of a nuclear option for some,
Yeah.
universities or companies. So that'll definitely be something that we have to, well, like you said, it can be adapted, just not retroactively.
Yeah. At least you're thinking about it, that's,
Yeah,
that
and
you give credit.
If y'all,
A lot.
Yeah.
if y'all write the code, you can, change the dual license however you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's your code.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't remember if you mentioned, but what's the language of the backend?
The backend is in Python. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the graph store that you use?
Neo4j,
Okay.
so Java. But it does well.
You had to touch Java.
We do.
And
I managed to not
putting
touch Java in almost a decade, and we had to touch it.
and putting on my my programmer hat also, you talking about potential interesting things I could see this being used for, because as you talked about, trees are ubiquitous in computer science. I mean, it's how almost everything's represented. I mean, for those who aren't programmers, I mean, literally the web page in your browser is a glorified tree at the end of the day. All of the graphical elements are just
I
renderings
think
of nodes
HTML
in
is
the tree.
on this list of
But
buzzwords.
speaking of
I
trying
use tree
to
markup language.
and there are a ton of benefits to the tree model, like
Yeah.
binary sort, Huffman encoding. There's reasons we use it, but one thing I thought might be very interesting, that it could potentially be a useful front-end design analysis tool, because you could take the DOM tree and you could apply your sort of rhizomatic tool to it, and you might be able to surface things like seemingly unrelated nodes in the DOM are all sharing the same CSS class, for instance, and it could hint
Oh,
at
wow.
ways to refactor the code that's more efficient and builds a better website.
Whoa.
Oh, that's interesting.
Whoa.
That's above so low.
Yeah.
Oh, that's my expertise. So
And then
that's what I
reaches
hear
out and
when I hear
types it
your
for you
tool.
from your screen. And
Well, it can point out to you things that in your web page are not directly related by node proximity,
Sure.
but there may be a conceptual relationship from attributes.
right,
or
like
something.
like a lot of these like front end frameworks are kind of becoming object oriented essentially, and like reusable components is a big thing in React, and you can just easily be like, oh, identify things that should be components, like
well,
what are the shared
I'm
objects?
in the Angular world, so it's like
I'm
React on
assuming there's
steroids.
some. Yeah. I don't touch either, so. I have no idea.
But anyway, I could see that being quite useful because a lot of front end code is bad. Even with these modern frameworks, it's bad. And
Yeah.
I could actually see your tool being very useful to helping create tools that could make people write better, more efficient front end code because it'll get them out of thinking in this tree paradigm.
Maybe that's our SaaS that we used to fund the whole thing. It's like.
A lot of the node base that I work in, like it's back end and front end a little bit. So you actually, while you're building the front end, you can actually see the dependencies and how long it takes to process each piece. So you can actually optimize it by like bringing things closer to where its dependency is, and that definitely kind of helps, especially when you're thinking spatially. You have all these parents and children. You can start grouping them in a way spatially that makes sense.
Yeah.
Allows you to just optimize everything really quickly.
Yeah, using it for optimization is a interesting thing. I never thought about that as a usable function of it.
Apply it to itself and
Yeah.
let
Just
it
let it
take
run.
off.
Yeah.
Rack up a GCP bill.
Well,
Ha!
maybe
We'll
even,
get the slime mold.
or maybe even,
Yeah, we'll get a new undersea cable network that
Yeah,
is
there you
or maybe,
determined is more appropriate.
or maybe even you can make this available to Wikipedia editors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, you know, in my opinion, would be like the most gratifying thing is if Wikimedia were to
They
be
actually
like,
change the articles to better reflect how they're used.
yeah, I think that would be awesome if this tool could kind of begin to
That's how you fit
Ouroboros
the neighborhood.
the whole, what?
You show people how they fit in the neighborhood as they're editing.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
even better, you start with a new Wikipedia article with no citation links yet, run this thing over it, and it will suggest all the citation links it should go to.
Right, and start building out more articles.
Exactly.
Actually, people doing stuff like that.
Yeah, generating content. And
Yeah, there are people at least like suggesting new articles and content.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
That makes sense.
Well, part even why I thought of that is I was reading a very interesting article that was talking about merging two sort of old school functional programming AI things that originated in the 70s. One sort of being metacircular evaluators or programming languages written in terms of themselves, and the other one being sort of query-based programming where you sort of start with a corpus of knowledge and then you surface new facts from it. Where I was reading a paper a few years ago where somebody married these two concepts and created a program where you could give that program the specification for, I want a program that will do these things, and it would output you the source code that would be that program, basically.
yeah. I mean, the last time I was here, the last time I was at a
Most of the Kestrel
speech here, yeah.
Most of the Kestrel is.
It might have been. I was reading about it just recently. Somebody on Quora linked it, and I was very fascinated. 'Cause
Kestrel were one group that were doing that.
Yeah, because I knew about the two independent concepts, but I was like, whoa, somebody combined them. That's a cool idea.
You had a question?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the meetup, you were talking about IndieWeb and the,
Well, that
I
was,
guess,
I
the
mentioned
Fediverse. Yeah,
I
you mentioned that. So a lot of the push around privacy advocacy nowadays is we're worried about centralization
Yeah.
or balkanization even.
Yeah.
And so kind of democratizing knowledge or democratizing access to this information, splitting that up against various nodes in a federated sort of system is kind of the trend for, Mastodon and all of that sort of stuff, right?
Sure, yeah.
Is it possible to create
Sharded.
graph-style databases, not of the system, but of, if I make a query on one federated system and it is connected to some federated system, do I, as the owner of that node, have to have a copy of that other federated system in order to make that graph query? Or can I guess, federate my graph queries? I don't know the math or anything behind that.
Right,
don't know
I
if
think
that's
that you would run
complex.
into a difficulty. There would have to be a guarantee of parity. Like there would have to be kind of like in the, I don't know what people are calling it nowadays, but like the master-slave replication thing, you would have to abide by some sort of guarantee there for integrity checks.
Gotcha. So
Um,
like, there's no way to take your system and spread it across 15 different federated systems.
I
to
think
share
that would
the
be
load of
that would be, you get into a lot of consensus problems there. I actually work at
Okay.
Factum, which is a distributed ledger company.
Okay.
So
There you go.
barely possible, but not without a lot of overhead around achieving consensus in a democratic way. You kind of have to have a level of centralization unless you go with a blockchain, which is
Gotcha.
not
But
fast.
one of the original inventors of the wiki concept now actually has a sort of a distributed federated wiki as a project. So, and how you sort of copy it and how you, so you can have multiple versions, you sort of subscribes to someone. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like one big cloud, so all the nodes kind of know about each other, but you actually get to choose like whose versions you stitch together, so you get your own personal view of this huge
Yeah,
federated wiki.
Yeah, there are a lot of databases that do support like, with IoT being what it is, there's been a lot of databases that need to maintain state across multiple small nodes. But you basically, it's assumed that those are federated under a single owner, essentially. So you have to have a lot of control over the nodes actually running those clients that maintain the data. So it's
Right.
kind of hard to just be like, here, you can download a node and sync it, and then we assume that you'll be accurate and up to date. Otherwise, we can fault you, and we have to have an elections, or at least this is how we handle it at my work. Which is like, we have an election system that
Yeah.
says, hey, this guy is repeatedly a bad actor, we need to boot him
Gotcha.
from the pool.
So, I was thinking more in terms of like, it's just like Wikipedia, it's okay if something's wrong,
Mm.
it will get corrected quickly.
Yeah.
And so if you had various graphs that are loosely connected, like you're just trying to create the path.
Right.
And if one of those things that you're querying across a federated system
Yeah.
ends up breaking or not meeting some sort of sanity check or something like that,
Yeah.
that link just doesn't, you can toss that.
Well, I think that,
You-
I think we would be hitting our head against the actual Neo4j
Okay.
graph protocol because of the way that it handles like indexes and things like that. I'm not a database engineer, but I think that that's very complex and difficult. And in addition to that, with the source code being published and the snapshots of Wikipedia being available, the database is repeatable, reproducible easily. So there's no actual value except for computation time to the graph database itself. That's kind of a secondary. It's a byproduct of running the source code on a data set.
Although
So in that way, you could run the client on top of your own data set if you wanted to. That may be
Yeah.
a nice way to negotiate that.
Yeah, like the thread I was pulling on was, okay, like how do I do search in a federated system? Like how do I get away from Google
Yeah.
having this,
I think you would have to ask.
basically what you're doing only on a
Right.
massive surveillance
Are you
level?
familiar with IPFS, Interplanetary
Yes.
File System? Yeah, I think that.
But that's just a big distributed hash table, right?
No, so it's more complicated than that. Yeah, it's more complicated than that. But the whole DHT thing was tried in like the early 2000s, and it was found to have some like metadata exploits and things. But IPFS is a little bit different, and it's actually a consensus mechanism, kind of what I was describing earlier.
Okay.
But basically, you hit a lot of really, really difficult game theory problems
Got it.
when you try and truly democratize a data set.
Although, assuming you were again going to try to resolve the issue of different federated graphs and trying to resolve those different graphs, I mean, you could maybe even kind of take the weighting up a level of meta, where you assign a weighting to each of the federated graphs based upon some trustworthiness algorithm or
Right.
metric,
Right.
and then
Yeah, and that's where
get a consensus truth graph based from the amalgamation of all the federated graphs.
Yeah, you basically have like a slider in terms of these kind of problem sets. You have like a slider that you can adjust that's like basically between like centralization and accuracy and decentralization and inaccuracy, and you're basically picking where you want to be.
Choose your own political philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's secretly a circle though. You just back around. And Yeah.
So what's on the roadmap? When are you gonna open this up to everybody?
Well, I think once we can get the weighting engine working and a multi-path view that we are happy with, we would open it up to the public. But right now it's in private beta. So, and I'm actually, what time is it? It's 8:25. So I was gonna pop open my laptop and kind of pass it around, or you guys could just come over and
We
Type
have the
it in.
room till 9, so that's an option if people are interested.
yeah.
What's
Yeah,
that?
if they have more questions,
We had the room
it's
till
totally
9,
fine.
so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how long do you think that's gonna take? When do you think that's gonna happen?
I think that will be. It's December now. I think it would likely be.
What am I committing to?
Yeah.
It took us a year to get to this point.
Yeah, and I think that like we've kind of found our stride in a way, and
No, just my phone.
it comes down to what kind of front end engineering resources we can get access to. So I'd probably say sometime in Q2 would be like maybe not a public beta, but a more robust private beta to let
That's
people do
April
things like multipath.
through June for those who don't think in quarters.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I would cut 7%.
Well, everybody in this room does.
No way you can be more accurate than that.
Yeah, the thing you might want to look is at Ward Cunningham's Federated Wiki. That's the project for like building a fully decentralized
What was the name of it?
distributed wiki. Ward Cunningham is the guy who invented the original wiki concept, and that's what he's working on. It's called the Federated Wiki.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, that would be cool. You had a question?
Yeah, I would guess this may be longer term more than near term if y'all are thinking about it, but you, in your first, kind of introductory slides, you talked about the 230 something languages that
Mhm.
Wikipedia is translated into.
Yep.
Do y'all have any plans to, for no edge, for your
Yes.
tools, to be looking at the different language versions? And do you have an idea, or have you looked into any of the data to, are the results different based on the language? When you get to
Oh,
things
yeah.
like weighting and some of the, I'm just curious if y'all are looking at that and if that's in the plans.
Yeah, I mean, currently we're trying to use our domain-specific knowledge of English
Yeah.
to kind of build the tool out. But I have no doubt that there's actually a lot, and I tried to kind of hint at that, but I think that
Yeah.
multiple interpretations of the same concept and then merging those two, or being able to view both simultaneously would actually be super productive,
Yeah.
and sort of filling in little gaps here and there.
You might
The issue would
have-
become in translation.
I think if your language tools only work with one language, you're probably an advertiser.
But-
And not a
I mean,
You know, like they should inherently.
Yeah, fair.
I could say one of the most fascinating things though, if you do that, is that if you like eventually build it out for each different language, and then you have your high level subway view of each language, you actually might finally have a decent visualization of actually how different languages think about the world in different ways actually, because people have been trying to do that forever, but it
Yeah,
always turns into
2000%.
pseudoscientific nonsense. You might actually have a decent representation of that actually.
There's some beautiful work coming out around that. Like, we're making progress on that hard problem that we've been working on for so much human history.
Well, based on how you guys are planning on doing the weighting right now, like, how much work is that gonna be to add each language?
I think the dumb stuff. Oh, for each language.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's say you
That's a
finish,
domain
you
expertise problem
finish
more than a
English.
technical problem.
Yeah, I think it just is a question of like, we can currently do it on English.
Yeah.
I can do the dumb stuff, Steven can do the smart stuff. But when it comes to a different language, understanding how those models, the like trained models are going to occur, and feel free to correct me if I say a dumb word. But yeah, I think it just becomes a question of like recognizing what your model is good at, what you need to tweak about the input data and the training methodology. And that requires a level of understanding of the language itself,
Well,
so you can know what to
that-
look for.
That's why I wanna self-promote my idea again.
Yeah.
Of the doing it by, number of users, like, doing stuff. That's
Yeah,
language
just letting
independent.
that inform the system.
That's language independent, so,
Yeah.
English, you're then done with all two and number three.
Yeah, and I really didn't mean to imply that like that data is useless or anything like that. Like I think that there is a ton of information there. I think it's just a question that we're not really close to answering right now, and also imposes some scary questions for us that I think we'd rather kick down the road a little bit.
And I'd also say that
Yeah.
from a project management perspective,
Yeah.
the fact that you guys are limiting your scope is good. Like,
Yeah.
you do one thing well before you do 10,000 things
Right.
poorly.
We're not trying to boil the ocean.
No punch card.
But I personally, yeah, maybe like once you complete English or whatever, you could use the number thing as a quality assurance mechanism,
Yeah.
like for your changing the models for another language.
Right, and I think that you could get into like kind of self-informing training models based on usage that could amplify important relationships and be like, hey, enable user data. Do you want to see how users have weighted this? I think there's like a lot of avenues to use that data. I think that data is genuinely useful. I think there are just some difficult questions on how to use it. So until we get like some sort of, you know,
We have to make
with
people
the
feel good first.
homomorphic encryption, until we get like really useful homomorphic encryption, I think that question's gonna be hard for a long time.
Are you guys doing any actually user research to figure out like how users do actually use it? Not, I don't mean watching the stats, but literally studies with people actually using it for things and figuring
Well, so
out.
this is actually the first day we're opening up the private beta.
Okay.
So
This is the start of that.
starting now.
All right, cool.
Yeah, so we would
And-
love to get your feedback. We're gonna take your emails. We'll reach out to you. We are gonna use your emails. They're gonna be stored on a Notion document that's private to me.
I think my email's out there enough that I really don't care anymore.
If you don't have a throwaway email, how are you-
That plus the number of you've been phoned messages I get per week anyway, it's like, who cares?
Yeah.
But anyway, the other question, so is your code hosted anywhere, or is the code still?
Yeah, we're pushing it up to GitHub this week.
Okay, so you're pushing to GitHub. Do you have an account, or do you already have like the URL where it's gonna live?
Yeah, we've already got the URL up and running.
Did you show that?
No, we didn't. We're gonna have him add it to the actual website. Is this your laptop? Oh, sorry. Let me grab my laptop so people can do that.
So you're taking the sign ups?
Recorder's so good.
So anybody interested in this, now's the time to get in.